Thank you. Right. Thank you all for being here and mainly to the speakers. So yeah, welcome to this second virtual seminar for the STN, Dispersal and Mating Systems. So the topic today that we're gonna talk about is sex-biased dispersal. So the two speakers are Xiang-Yi Richter and Tom Miller. And each talk would last approximately 25 to 30 minutes. And after each talk, we will have 10 to 15 minutes of discussion. So then feel free to just ask many questions. I'm sure the speakers will be very glad. So the first speaker is Xiang-Yi Richter, so you did your, sorry, I hope I'm not, I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
Oh, I thought Tom is going to give the talk first.
But right, or is it Tom? Maybe.
Doesn't matter.
Then we can just start with Tom. Sorry, I. Okay, then Tom, if it's fine for you, you will start the seminar. So you did your PhD at the University of Nebraska, supervised by Svata Londa. And so it was mostly field experiments and the effect of herbivory on different plant life history traits. And so you then followed with two postdocs in Florida University and Rice University. And since then you've been an associate professor at Rice University, and you still use many field experiments, and you have much more of like a ecology aspects in your research. So very much looking forward to your talk, and I will let you share your screen if it's fine for you. And I will unmute my.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Does everybody see my screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you again for the intro. Good afternoon to you. It's 8 a.m. for me, so good morning to any of you in North America. And I'm happy to be here and excited by the theme of what y'all are doing and the way that this is organized. So this is a really interesting group. So I'm glad to be part of it for today. So I'm going to focus on sex biases in dispersal and demography, and I really sort of come at this question from a population biology perspective, focusing on both demography and dispersal. So I know that the theme is dispersal, but I'm going to sneak in some demography as well. So I'm really a population biologist. And, through that lens, I really see ecology and ecological dynamics as driven by demography and dispersal. So any change in population through time and space must ultimately reflect underlying demographic processes. So like all of the life cycle transitions that give rise to births and deaths, combined with dispersal, the way in which individuals can move across landscapes. So we can sort of cartoonize those as some kind of life cycle diagram representing paths through the life cycle and the vital rates that individuals sort of express. And dispersal can be represented as something like a probabilistic dispersal kernel representing the likelihood of movement, a certain distance, for example, where most movement is concentrated close by and there's some tail of long distance movement. And it's this coupling of demography and dispersal that gives rise to, I think, just about everything that we see in nature one way or another. So population biologists are often really interested in population structure. And so we need to sort of bring a structured perspective to the way that we think about demography and dispersal. And sex structure is one of the most common types of structure because most animals and many plants are dioecious, having separate female and male individuals. And that complicates this picture because it raises the possibility that demographic processes are sex biased in some way, where males and females may exhibit different trajectories through their life histories. And dispersal can also be sex biased, where, maybe those tails of long distance movement can differ between the sexes. And I find this a really interesting dilemma because, ecologists are always trying to develop conceptual or mathematical theory in ways that distill problems to their barest bones, right? And so we want to get rid of things that, complexities that we can safely ignore and focus on the important stuff. And so to me, this question of sex structure is one of these interesting questions of, is that a complexity we can ignore, or do we really need to account for females and males and their potential life history differences and dispersal differences to make, good ecological inferences and predictions? So I'm going to talk about work today that sort of addresses that question in a few different ways. So the talk will actually be sort of broken down into two parts, one focus on sex biases and dispersal. And that's kind of older work for me, but because I know that's the theme, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm also going to spend more time on some more recent stuff, focusing on sex biases and demography and responses to global change. So part one, sex biases and dispersal. And in this context, we're really focused on population dynamics as a spatiotemporal process. And so thinking about range expansion, for example, spread of invasive species or movement of species in response to climate change, these are often wave-like trajectories where populations can grow in time and space. So this is a cartoon representing each line as some generation of spread temporally and spatially. So as ecologists, we often want to understand this process of range expansion and try to understand what are the factors that control how fast that wave can spread. And that's the question I'm going to focus on through this lens of sex structure. And as I mentioned, this is mostly older work, and I want to acknowledge colleagues who've collaborated on these projects. So particularly Allison Shaw and Mike Newbert and Brian Inouye contributed to some of the work that I'll share today. So sex biases, as I mentioned, are common. This is a mini meta-analysis looking at sex biases and dispersal distance for a bunch of lepidopterans, so butterflies and moths, as well as birds on the right. So this is the log ratio of mean female to mean male dispersal distance. And the point being simply that sex differences in dispersal are pretty common. They're often directional in different groups. And so, for example, in insects, male biases in dispersal, where males have longer dispersal distances, are pretty common. In birds, it's actually the opposite, where this distribution is a little bit leaning towards female bias. And there's a lot of evolutionary theory, much of which I'm sure this group probably knows really well, about how how factors like mating system can influence the evolution and the direction of sex biases and dispersal. So I'm going to really focus on the ecological consequences of those patterns and what does it mean to have females and males moving differently, particularly in that context of range expansion. So this is kind of cartoonizing how that sex difference might matter across a traveling wave of population density from some range core to range edge. So if we imagine some, gradient of core to edge, if there are sex differences in movement, that raises the likelihood of sex biases at the front of the expanding edge. And the front of an expanding population is where all the action is. So that's the part of an expanding wave that's really pulling it forward. So that's where we want to sort of focus attention, as the factors that control the speed at which an expanding wave can spread. And so in this example that I've drawn, there's female bias dispersal, which gives declines in the sex ratio along that gradient, where there may be no sex bias in the range core, but we get sex biases at the front of the expanding edge. And that can be ecologically consequential in a way that depends on the mating system. So, for example, in a monogamous mating system where males and females pair off to mate, the maximum growth rate that they could exhibit would be maximized at a 1-to-1 sex ratio. So this plot that I've drawn here, let me actually pull up a pointer. Here, so this represents the ways in which the low density growth rate might respond to sex ratio variation. So this hump would say that this low density growth rate is maximized at a 1-to-1 sex ratio, such that biases in sex ratio at the front would actually decelerate population growth and decelerate range expansion. A different scenario might emerge in a different mating system like polygyny, where few males are required to fertilize many females. And in that scenario, it could be that female bias at the front would actually have an accelerating effect because the bias in sex ratio is in the direction that favors more rapid population growth at the expanding edge. So sex ratio and mating system really matter for understanding the ways in which dispersal biases affect range expansion. And that result is sort of better summarized in this figure, which is derived from theoretical models of sex bias dispersal under different mating systems, showing that the invasion speed, the rate at which that expanding edge can move forward, is maximized at no dispersal bias in a monogamous mating system, but could be maximized under different directions of dispersal bias in alternative mating systems in which either males or females are more limiting for population growth. But in any of these cases, really strong sex differences in dispersal would always have a decelerating effect. So once males and females are moving too differently, that would always tend to decelerate range expansion because it raises the likelihood of sort of missed mating opportunities at that expanding edge. So this is an example where this question of, how much does sex structure really matter? I think we would argue that you can make really sort of the wrong predictions or the wrong inferences, ignoring sex structure. And I didn't mention this explicitly, but, most theory in, range expansion and population biology more generally does ignore sex structure and is really sort of female dominant, either implicitly or explicitly. So this is a case where accounting for males and male-female interactions could be really important. So I am actually an experimentalist at heart, and so we wanted to test some of these ideas. And so we did so in a laboratory system that I'm showing here. So these are bean beetles. So a little lab rat, not literally, but sort of a easily manipulable laboratory system of insects that we can work with in the lab. They complete their life cycle on beans that we can buy at their grocery store. And so we created these experimental landscapes for bean beetle populations to spread through. And the data figure on the left is representing one replicate of an expanding beetle population over, in this case, 9 generations, where each line represents a generation. And we could measure the velocity of expansion as the sort of displacement of that leading edge each generation. And so we were really interested in testing some of the ideas from the theory that I showed you about how sex biases and dispersal could sort of tune the invasion speed as a function of mating system. So we did some experiments where we can actually manipulate bias in dispersal because in a lab environment, we can sort of control who moves where. So we created dispersal treatments that were male biased or unbiased or female biased. And what you can see in the results here, which is showing invasion speed in response to those treatments, is that you can accelerate these bean beetle invasions as you move from male bias to female bias dispersal, holding mean dispersal constant. And this is a polygynous mating system. So this is one of these cases where you really only need a few male beetles to fertilize many female beetles. And so this is exactly what we would have predicted from the theoretical models, that female bias dispersal in this case is actually accelerating. And that's exactly what the beetles told us as well. So overall, the sort of message out of this work is that sex structure does matter for understanding invasion dynamics, and that sort of those theoretical predictions are supported experimentally. So I'm going to transition from there to thinking about kind of the other side of population dynamics and thinking more about demography and sex differences in demography. And this part is really motivated from a global change context and trying to, many of us are trying to understand what the future will look like under a rapidly changing and rapidly warming planet. These are data figures that we're probably all familiar with, just reinforcing the point that, anthropogenic climate change driven by CO2 emissions is accelerating, and the trajectories of the future are uncertain, but have more optimistic or more pessimistic scenarios, all of which will involve some degree of climate warming. So understanding ecological responses to that warming is a major goal. So bringing in this question of sex differences, one of the challenges here is that males and females could respond differently to climate stressors. So going back to thinking about a sex-structured life cycle, like I was cartoonizing earlier, you could have males and females that have different responses to climate stress in ways that they exhibit through their demographic rates. So vital rates like survival or growth or reproduction would presumably be impacted by climate stress in ways that might differ between males and females. So that's one complication for making predictions about dioecious populations responding to global change. The other reason why this problem gets really tricky is that not only do you have males and females responding differently, but sex-structured dynamics always involve feedbacks. That's one of the reasons why most theory doesn't involve sex structure, because it's simplifying to just get rid of males. But if you actually are accounting for both males and females, then you have feedbacks where sex differences in demography can generate biases in the sex ratio, and then biases in the sex ratio would feed back to the vital rates. The most obvious example of that would be that female fertility is a function of the mating pool. So who is available as mates, what is the availability of males for female fertility. So these two factors of sex differences in demography and that feedback from the mating pool to the vital rates are some of the challenges in building models that really sort of embrace sex differences in a global change setting. And we wanted to sort of try to tackle that and see how far we can get with it. So we're working here with dioecious plants. So I've presented some theoretical work, some insect work. I'm probably mainly a plant ecologist at heart, so this is going a little bit truer to my roots. So, most plants are hermaphroditic, having both female and male function, but some plants are dioecious, and it's taxonomically rare. So about 5%, 5 to 8% of plant species are dioecious, but among that group are some really ecologically important species. So, these are some examples on the slides, but things like willows and poplars and hollies. We work a lot on grasses, and so that's what I'm going to focus on. But dioecious plants are out there, and they're often ecologically important kind of foundation species that are really important for ecosystems. Prior work on dioecious plants has raised the hypothesis that climate warming is likely to favor male-biased sex ratios, and this is following the theory that females incur greater costs of reproduction than males. Females are maturing seeds and fruits and have higher resource demands to do so than males have to produce pollen, for example. So the energetics of reproduction are different for females and males, and so that leads to this hypothesis that's in the literature that climate stress would be more impactful on females and lead to a male advantage. So potentially male bias sex ratios under climate stress. And so that was one of the hypotheses that we had sort of developing some of the work that I'll tell you about. So this is work that's in collaboration with Dr. Jacob Mutuama, who's a current postdoc in my lab at Rice, and Dr. Aldo Campagnoni, who's a former postdoc. And this, again, is I'm going to talk about a series of papers. I'll focus mainly on Jacob's most recent paper, which is forthcoming hopefully in a few weeks. And this is work that's focused on a dioecious grass species, Texas bluegrass. And this is what it looks like in the field. Females produce the receptive reproductive structures. Males produce anthers, the pollen-producing structures, and those are separated on different individuals. And sex expression is genetically based in this system, as is true in many dioecious plant systems. So our goal with this work was to develop and contrast two models of population viability and potential range shifts under climate change. And one of those, and kind of the null model that we're working with, is a female dominant model. And as I mentioned, a lot of kind of traditional ecological theory is implicitly or explicitly female dominant, focusing only on females. And so that was an important benchmark for us. So that would mean understanding how females respond to climate stressors and using female responses exclusively to make some prediction about population viability in response to change in climate. The other model is a two-sex model that builds upon that, but includes males. So that allows for the possibility that females and males differ in their response to some underlying environmental stressors in ways that can create bias in the sex ratio. And sex ratio bias would have this feedback to affect vital rates, particularly female fertility. And that creates this additional pathway through which climate stressors can influence population viability. So our goal was really to build and contrast a female-only kind of model mechanism and contrast that with a two-sex model that accounts for that feedback. Using that experimental or that system that I introduced that I'll tell you more about. So we conducted two experiments, one that quantifies this feedback from the sex ratio to the vital rates, and a second that quantifies sex differences in responses to climate stressors. So I'm going to briefly show you some results from those experiments and then put them together into these contrasting models. So the first experiment is a response surface design experiment where we manipulated the densities and frequencies of males and females in experimental plots. So this figure is not a results figure, it's actually an experimental design figure showing where we allocated experimental effort in male-female space, creating experimental populations, for example, that would be majority female with few males. And this is what that looked like in the field. And all of these white tags are females. And there is a red tag here that would be a male. So that's a strongly female biased population. We can create the alternative of strongly male biased populations, many males, few females. So these are lots of red tags. Presumably there's a white tag somewhere in there that would be the female. And then of course we can create lots of combinations in between. So in doing so, we create these different mating environments and we can measure seed production in response to that sex ratio manipulation. And this is the main result from that work where I'm plotting seed viability. So this is the fraction of initiated seeds that were fertilized as a function of the operational sex ratio. So the fraction of the flowers in that population effectively that were female. And the main results that I'll emphasize here are that as you go to strongly male biased populations, that maximizes female fertility. So the rare female in a sea of males, these are wind pollinated plants. I should have mentioned that earlier. Female rarity in a high density of males actually maximizes fertility, which you might expect under wind pollination. At the other end of things, female only populations effectively produce no seeds, which is also kind of what you'd expect. And then most of the interesting information we get comes sort of in the shape of this relationship. And we can sort of recognize that we get pretty good seed production and pretty good seed viability until about 75% female or so. And at that point, things become a little too female biased and there's not quite enough pollen to pollinate all the ovules that the females are initiating. So here's what that potential feedback looks like of where bias in the sex ratio can feedback to influence vital rates. So the other piece that we need to know is how females and males respond differently or whether they respond differently to their underlying sort of climate stressors. And to do that, we did a big common garden transplant study across the South Central Great Plains of the United States. So this is a map of Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. For anybody who's familiar with this part of the world. And these colored points represent our common garden locations. These are places that we created experimental populations of females and males. And this is covering a lot of climate space, as I'll show you in a second. But we're really using geography here as a way to sample different climate environments. And there's a lot going on this map, but I'll just highlight that those gray points are representing the natural distribution of this species. So it's a Southern Great Plains endemic, and our experimental sites and span and to some extent exceed the natural distribution of the species, again giving us lots of climate space to explore. So at each of those locations, we created experimental gardens, planted females and males, so known sex individuals. We can do that. This is one of the nice things about plants, is you can sort of clonally propagate plants. And because sex is genetically based, we can take a female clone make lots of females and bring them all over the range. And so we did that with a bunch of clones, a bunch of genotypes, and that was our sort of trick for getting sex representation all over this this geography. This is the climate space that we're sampling. So this is a plot showing precipitation and temperature, and every experimental site is represented in this plot. And I'm using these arrows to represent climate change. So the way to read this, and I'll use this pink site in southeastern Kansas as an example, we can focus on these arrows as the corresponding climate representation. So this arrow, the solid arrow, is representing climate change from past to present. So it has gotten wetter and warmer at that site. And I've also plotted two possible futures. We don't know the future, but we can sort of bracket more optimistic or more pessimistic scenarios of global change. And so I'm plotting, those two scenarios, and the arrows that go further up in temperature are the more pessimistic scenarios. So the main thing I want you to take away from this figure is that we're covering a lot of climate space with our sort of geographically distributed experiment, and there's pretty compelling climate change historically and into the future. The precipitation dimension of climate change is kind of interesting. It actually has gotten wetter, but is expected to go back to getting drier in the future. So that many of these arrows are kind of zigzagging, from right to left, but they're all going up, and they're all, they're all warming pretty in ways that are kind of frightening. These are going to really high temperatures. These are growing season temperatures. So cool season temperatures are getting warm all over the range. So that's the climate change context that we want to make some predictions about. Okay, I'm going to go straight to the results of our models, bypassing a lot of the interesting data, which I just don't have time to show you, but these are demographic models incorporating all the sex-specific vital rates like growth, survival, reproduction, that feedback to seed fertility. And I'm plotting here our best inference about the probability of population viability. So the likelihood that populations can reach at least replacement level growth rates across climate space. So this is using all of that climate coverage to build a sort of climate niche model for these populations. So the way to read this figure is that these, more yellow or tan colors are higher population viability predictions, and so higher niche suitability. And I'm showing this figure for I should have showed these earlier. So that's the way to read the colors from high to low niche suitability. And this panel on the left is the female dominant model. And we can contrast our predictions of niche suitability from left to right, looking at female dominant and two-sex models. The only difference between them is that the two-sex model accounts for that feedback from the sex ratio to seed production. And what I want you to notice is that the climate niche is narrower in the two-sex model. So there are regions of climate space, particularly at high and low temperatures, that the female dominant model predicts are moderately to pretty strongly suitable, and regions of climate space, and those same regions of climate space are predicted by the two-sex model to be unsuitable. So we have kind of a more pessimistic or a narrower perspective on the climate niche that comes from the two-sex model that accounts for males and females and their feedbacks. And we can take this climate niche that is here plotted in climate space and project it onto real space, so real geography. And that's what I'm showing in a series of maps that I'll kind of build up here. So again, we're now looking at population suitabilities, so the likelihood of a population reaching replacement level population growth across now geography. I wish these were the same color ramps, but sorry, this is a little bit of a different color scheme. White here represents the most suitable. So we have, complete confidence given the data and our uncertainty that populations could reach at least replacement level growth in really across all of Texas in this scenario. And this species is called Texas bluegrass. So that's kind of where we would expect to find climate suitability. And the greener areas represent declining climate suitability. So I'm showing you this map that represents our forecast under present climate conditions, again, representing high and low suitability. And I'm now going to sort of build that out to contrast past to future, and this is for the female dominant model. And what you can notice is that the climate suitability is moving north, and that's kind of the classic poleward migration that is expected in lots of species under climate warming. Moving north in the northern hemisphere, of course, moving south in the southern hemisphere. So that's this sort of movement of the white regions that are the high suitability regions. And we can notice here the difference between the more optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, a really strong poleward migration under the more pessimistic scenario, where in fact most of Texas will become unsuitable for this species. It's called Texas bluegrass, but it's going to lose all of its Texas habitat suitability under the pessimistic climate change scenario. So that's female dominant. Let's contrast that with a two-sex model. That's what I'm plotting here. And there's a few things I want you to notice. One is that in broad strokes, these look really similar. So, going back to that question I started with, how important is it to account for sex structure and all those feedbacks? If we wanted to make a really kind of broad conclusion about, our poleward migration, is that likely for this species? The female dominant would give us the right answer, because the two-sex model that has all this additional complexity effectively tells us the same thing. We see that movement of the high suitability regions. But they do differ, and we can visualize those differences a little more clearly by subtracting the top map from the bottom map, and that's what I'm plotting in this last row. And if we can notice, and I'll highlight particularly under the more pessimistic climate change scenario, the red areas are areas where the female dominant model is over predicting climate suitability. And there are whole regions of the distribution where you get 20 to 40% sort of overestimation of climate suitability from the female dominant model. So I want to sort of make this a little bit of a nuanced conclusion here that in broad strokes these models agree, and a female-only perspective kind of gets it right in thinking about poleward migration. But if we wanted to make narrower decisions about what are places that are going to become more or less suitable, or where are suitable locations for assisted migration, for example, we might want that more focused and more nuanced perspective, because there's the two-sex model is a little more pessimistic throughout much of the range. Why is it more pessimistic? And this kind of gets back to the feedback. The two-sex model predicts that sex ratios will become more female biased under climate change. So I'm showing here the predicted distributions of sex ratio. These are aggregate distributions from across the range under past, present, future conditions. And there's lots of lines here, but the main thing I want you to notice is that under the climate change scenarios, these distributions are shifting to the right, higher representation of females. And recall that due to that feedback with vital rates, once you get to 75% female or so, there's going to be negative feedbacks to seed production. So the reason that we see that narrower climate suitability in a two-sex model is that sex ratios are being pushed towards that edge of where seed production really starts to decline under scarcity of males. So the future is female for this species, actually. And that is interesting because you might recall that I started with this sort of hypothesis in the literature that climate change will generally favor male bias sex ratios because males are thought to be more stress tolerant. We found the opposite. We found that females are more stress tolerant than males, particularly at high and low temperature extremes. And that's really the basis for the results that I've showed you of why a two-sex model gives you a narrower climate niche, because females are getting overrepresented at those extreme climates. So the last thing I'll say before ending here is that we want to try to understand better about which direction is climate change pushing dioecious populations, at least dioecious plant populations? Is it going to be more female or more, or is it going to be more male? And, probably the better question is, what are the conditions under which we would expect, male bias or female bias? So we have new work going that I have no results to share yet, but we're doing a meta-analysis to try to answer that question. So this is phylogeny of lots and lots of dioecious species. We're trying to build this even further, and we're trying to understand what is the direction of change in sex ratio in response to climate stressors? And, what is the phylogenetic signal of that? What are the traits associated with that? And can we make some predictions about, which way it will tip in the future and the sort of the implications of that? So, I'm going to stop there and just say that sex structure is important. In some ways more than others. And I think there's a lot of value in unpacking that, understanding where simpler female-only approaches do just fine, and understanding where we really need that greater complexity. So I hope I've convinced you that accounting for sex structure can improve forecasts for range expansions and potentially range shifts under climate change. And that kind of surprisingly, climate change can push sex ratios in maybe in a variety of directions, and we really need more work to understand, which way it will go and under which conditions. And that's some of what we're hoping to do next. I want to acknowledge the funding that has supported this work and the collaborators that I've mentioned. Happy to stop there and take any questions.
Thank you so much. Is there any questions already in the audience? I can't see so well. Yes, please. Yeah.
Hello, Tom. Thanks for this very interesting talk. I have a very, very simple-minded question. Can the plants adjust the sex ratio of their offspring?
That's a really good question. I don't know is the short answer. The modeling work that I showed you assumes that they cannot. We do know that we do have empirical data that birth sex ratios are 1-to-1, but that comes from constant benign environments, and we don't know if more extreme environments could lead to skew in the primary sex ratio. So I assume it doesn't, but it might, and that's a great question.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I can't figure out where the raising your hand button is, but hi, Tom.
Hi, Nikki.
Great talk. So I have a question. I was wondering if you had an idea how transient this signal of sex bias dispersal might be in range expansion. The reason I'm asking is I'm working on damselflies these days, and we are looking at these parallel range shifting transects where we have male bias dispersal, and we see consistently a change towards a male bias sex ratio, but all the way along a transect going back decades. So I was wondering if you had an idea what could maintain this.
That's really interesting. So like when you say going back decades, so like is the front moving, but the front is always male biased? Is that?
The front is always male bias, but you still
Yeah.
see that male bias way behind the front. So like the front
Okay.
are most male biased, but you can see it go all the way south. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I guess to answer your question about transients, the consistent sex biases can generate consistent consistent sex biases and dispersal can generate consistent bias and sex ratio at the front. So if, range fronts are probably themselves transient phenomenon, right? Things can't spread forever, but like to the extent that they are asymptotic, you can get sort of asymptotically stable bias sex ratios at the front. But what you're describing makes me think about sex biases in demography, actually, because, I was assuming in some of that theoretical work that the sex differences were limited to dispersal, and that's the source of sex ratio bias. But if you have sex biases kind of consistently throughout the range core, range edge gradient, that might actually suggest sex differences in vital rates that are the source of that, as or more so maybe than sex differences in movement. So I think that's kind of a fun puzzle of
Yeah.
kind of thinking about the contributions of those two things.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, it's hard to see if people are raising their hands or anything. Yeah. Yes, one of the
Greta
two.
and Xiang-Yi.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, that's just for a curiosity. It's like I know you've done this range expansion. Well, you presented some, but also with your student Brad, you did kind of more range expansion with the beetles, where you look at evolution of dispersal. Have you looked at the sex bias that maybe was in the paper? I don't remember at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. I failed to mention it. So those beetles are female biased in their. I'm sorry, no, those beetles are male biased in their dispersal. So when we were creating scenarios of female bias, male bias, or unbiased, the male biased treatment actually matched what they do, their real patterns of dispersal. And then we flipped that to create female bias, which we can do just by moving beetles manually rather than letting them move themselves. The work that you're referring to is looking at evolution during range expansion. I think there's an interesting interface between those two questions or observations of, sex biases in movement and sex biases at range edges and evolution at range edges. The work in our lab has kind of treated those independently. We've actually never put them together in a rigorous way. I think it could be really interesting to understand the contributions of those sex differences to evolutionary potential at range edges. It's certainly the case in those bean beetle invasions, because they have male bias dispersal. You get you have really strong allele effects at the front, because you get lots of lonely males at the front that just die. And so like everything gets knocked back, effectively each generation. That's got to be doing something interesting, evolutionarily in terms of representation of alleles at the front. And we just haven't really dug into that.
Yeah, and at some point I would want to pick your brain on that, because we kind of did a similar experiment with one of my students, and we haven't published it yet. But no matter what we do to these beetles, we always find female bias dispersal.
Huh.
And obviously, we're aware of your paper that you always find male bias dispersal, and we tried in all sort of sources and vary the density, vary the sex ratio, vary the relatedness. It's always females bias. So at some point, I might drop you an email and pick your brain.
That's really fascinating. That I do know that females are more sensitive to density, and so females are more likely to exhibit density dependent dispersal. But if you said you've looked at all the density responses as well, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think those beetles, they have mysteries, and I think there's probably a lot of population differences, but like to have a complete switch in the direction of sex bias, that's the first I've heard of that, but that's surprising, and I'd love to talk more.
Maybe we have a fluke population. I would
Yeah.
love. Okay, thank you.
Oh yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much for the really interesting talk. I'm just kind of in general curious about how about in reality the sex ratio are in dioecious species, are they all more 1-to-1 sex ratio, or more generally male bias or female bias? Because you did the experiments and showing such kind of a strong the maximum fertilization and the strongly male biased, but it's in experimental setting. I'm just curious, how about in reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that question. So the sex ratios, and so this gets a little tricky to answer, because what we can measure in the field are operational sex ratios, and those can vary strongly from true population sex ratios. So what I mean by that is operational sex ratio is sort of the male-female representation among the mating individuals, in our case, the flowering individuals. But then there's the true composition of males and females in the population, including those who are not flowering. So what we know is that the operational sex ratios kind of vary really widely. We've seen everything from female only to male only populations and everything in between, but they're really dynamic. And so you go back to the same population next year, and it's something completely different. So so what we want to do is ideally we would have sort of genetic markers that would allow us to genotype individuals as male female to look at the sort of true underlying sex ratio, and understand better about how much of what we're seeing in the operational sex ratio is how biased is that picture relative to who's in the population. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, we get really strong variation in operational sex ratio, including biases in both directions.
Thank you so much. Can I ask one follow-up question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Because in that case, how do they any dispersal pattern in the plants? Do they actually also more female bias or male bias dispersal also in dioecious plants in general?
That's an interesting question. I would hypothesize no, because these are seeds, right? That it's seed movement that generates plant movement, and different plants have different types of dispersal vectors. The species we work on are probably primarily wind and water dispersed. But there's not any, to me, obvious mechanisms by which males and females could move differently. I could be very wrong about that. There might, nature is interesting, and who knows, there might be something that I'm not thinking of. But that's why, like, I didn't present much of an intersection of the two topics I talked about, the dioecious plants and the beetles, because the sex biases and dispersal, I think, are far less probable in dioecious plants. It's actually the sex differences in demography that are probably way more consequential, just because plants don't have movement behavior in the way that most animals do. But yeah, so that would be my speculation, that males and females would move effectively the same way because they're seeds, and however they get moved is probably not sex sorted.
Thank you so much.
Francisca has her hand up. I don't know if we have time for more questions.
Yeah, just let me know.
Maybe the last one. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for this fantastic talk. I was just curious because you said you found in your study system this difference in how the sexes react to climate stress, and I was wondering if you found out, like, in what way or why this difference arises, if you have any indication.
Yeah, so the short answer is no, we don't really know. I can say that the hypotheses that I mentioned of expecting male bias under climate stress is based on this rationale that females have a heavier investment in reproduction than males, and so they're more sensitive to climate stress. Our best speculation is that in the species that we were working on in that study, it's a wind pollinated plant, and particularly this time of year, many of us probably have allergies, right? So like males produce tons and tons of pollen, and so maybe this idea that pollen is cheap. Maybe it's cheap like per pollen grain, but like if you're a wind pollinated plants have to invest a lot in heavy pollen loads. So maybe wind pollinated species that flips, and maybe males actually do incur strong reproductive costs that could make them a little more sensitive to climate stress. That's one of the hypotheses we're hoping to address in that meta-analysis, because we have both wind and animal pollinated species. But that is our best speculation at the moment of why males might be more climate sensitive, but it is speculation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the attention and questions. This is fun. I'll turn it over to you, Xiang-Yi.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, Xiang-Yi. Yeah, I was looking for you amongst all videos. Yeah, so I will let you share your screen. Yeah. So maybe while you do that, I will briefly give a bit of an overview of your background. So you did your PhD at the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Plön. So you worked with Arne Traulsen, and so you mainly use game theory.
Yes.
And then you did a postdoc with Hannah Coco, where you started to study all these sex differences and sexual dimorphism, and you then stayed in Switzerland, where now you're an assistant professor, and you still apply game theory to understand different social interaction in animals and microbial world, if I understood correctly. So yeah, I will leave you now for your presentation.
Thanks a lot, Louise, for the introduction. Can you hear me all right? Okay.
Yes.
Let me go back. Yes, I'm currently in Bern, and although since last year I have get a professorship in University of Constance, they basically put me on unpaid leave on the same day when I got a professorship, so that I can finish the current project in University of Bern, and my people here can finish their work. So this is a really nice arrangement. That's why I'm affiliated now both to University of Bern and Constance. Today I'm going to talk about the work that I actually did before when I was a postdoc in Hannah Coco's lab. I was still very interested. I'm interested in this topic, but I haven't been working on it in the last few years, partly because, to get a professorship, you need to demonstrate that you can do something else than your supervisor. So I had been working on something different, but now to this topic, I'm going to talk about some of the old work. And that is what causes sex bias dispersal and how does mating system play a role. Okay, so what this idea of sex bias dispersal related to mating system come from? And this is a very influential old paper by Greenwood. The one I thought was where the idea come from. In the abstract, you can see clearly it's reads that males is usually females which disperse more, and in mammals it's normally males disperse more than females. And he argues that the direction of sex bias is a consequence of the type of mating system. And this in this paper, Greenwood argues this is because males and females, they have different benefit from staying in the local habitat without dispersing, and this differs between mating systems. And in that time, he surveyed different bird species, and he only found 4 bird species that is male bias dispersal, and they are all ducks. So at that time, it seems very clear this pattern in birds. It's very often female bias dispersal. And after that, because this paper is super influential, people also did some more work in surveying sex bias dispersal in different systems. This is a relatively recent paper, published 35 years after Greenwood's work. And we can still see that the high numbers, like people have developed different methods and worked on sex bias dispersal in many different species, but still you can see that and most work have been done in birds and mammals. And it seems the pattern holds that female birds disperse more and male mammals disperse a bit more. In the other taxa, it's less clear because the sample size is so small. So what's the logic behind this idea of mating system related to sex bias dispersal? Here, the verbal argument generally goes like that. If you are a male bird, you want to get a territory on nest site. And if you don't disperse, you stay in where you're born, then you're more familiar with the surrounding area. You know where to get a territory, where to get resources, then you can get, have an advantage in building your nest. And then you impress the females so that you pass on your gene. But if you're a male mammal, you want to get a harem, that is a lot of females, then because there's lots of competition at home, you better leave. It sounds reasonable, but if you think twice, it's not very convincing, because you can also argue if you're a male bird, you also have competition at home. Getting and being familiar with the area doesn't mean that you can actually get the nest site you want to get. And if a male mammal, you can still benefit from being familiar with the surrounding. Even though you might not be able to fight against a dominant male, you can wait, right? You can wait after he dies and you can take over. So this is verbal arguments, not very convincing. And so we were thinking, did Greenwood thought about using modeling to clarify the logical consequences of the argument? Apparently, at that time, there's already a very influential theory paper on dispersal published, that's by Hamilton and May, which Greenwood did not know, or at least he didn't cite. So this dispersal paper is probably one of the most influential one in dispersal models. It's published Nature, and it has a very short abstract, which indeed is very abstract. It only has 3 sentences. The middle one, the most important: a parent organism is expected to try to enter a high fraction of its propagules into competition for sites away from its own immediate locality, even when mortality to such dispersing propagule is extremely high. This is doesn't tell us much more, but the idea behind is quite simple and elegant. I will try to explain here. So Hamilton and May, they try to ask the question, like, can dispersal still evolve even if there's no obvious benefits? For example, you don't have to disperse to search for a mate. There's no inbreeding effect, and all habitats are full so that you cannot go somewhere to colonize a new habitat, and environments are the same and constant, so you cannot find a different environment, and there's no hazard in the local environment where that can, you can probably die from it. Even in this case, can dispersal still evolve? And their answer is yes. And try to show this with a very simple case where you have the same type of habitat, and in each habitat you have the same number of offspring. In the very simple case, there's just one. And all the habitats are the same, all individuals are the same. And now the individuals start to reproduce, each of them have the same fertility, and then there's competition, so only one of the offspring can survive by chance. And then population comes back to the beginning, and the cycle starts again. What happens is now there's mutation. This mutant individual is otherwise completely the same, like the wild type. The only difference is that it sends some offspring to disperse. So in this case, some of these yellow individuals move to the other habitat. And now you calculate the fitness of the yellow and blue individuals that are different. For the yellow ones, they for sure one of these remaining offsprings will survive. And with the chance 2 out of 7, one of these dispersed individuals can take over the other habitat. So, and instead, the non-dispersers will have a fitness of less than 1. Eventually, due to chance, it can happen that all these blue individuals die due to stochasticity, and then the yellow type will replace the non-dispersers. And that's why the rubber ducks are all yellow. Okay, so in this simple case where I was explaining, I didn't show any mortality, just want to show this logic behind it. But in the original paper, Hamilton and May, they did show that even when mortality rate is very high, and as shown in this reproduced figure, no matter if reproduction is sexual or asexual, population always on average should send at least half of the offspring to disperse. Okay, so while I was just saying that Greenwood didn't think about, models like kin competition can be an important driver of dispersal, and theoreticians, to be fair, also didn't take again so much from Greenwood's influential idea. At least haven't really examined them in formal models. We thought about, like, for example, Greenwood emphasized that the asymmetric fitness consequence of staying and dispersing in the local and dispersed habitats, and only one paper we can find has considered this. And also, Greenwood point out that mate searching can be a strong driver of male bias dispersal, and this obviously also requires polygyny as a mating system. And this has not been explored. So then we asked, why it is so hard to connect empirical and theoretical work. To illustrate this, I was thinking about we can simulate, you know, an empiricist and a theoretician texting each other. And the empiricist says, you know, we're interested in factor that makes one sex disperse more because, you know, all species disperse. It's given what's driving this, you know, the factors influencing one sex more than the other. Can you model that? And then the theoretician will think, you know, we can of course do this, but it's not interesting because if you assume one sex suffers or gain more from dispersing, of course your model is going to produce that. But what's more interesting is the fundamental driving force, like kin competition. So like why you don't measure it in empirical work. And that's because it's very hard. To show this, we come back to this rubber duck simple model. We can see that after reproduction, many in each of the local habitats, there will be many siblings and kin competition will be strong. And due to the kin competition, individual will start to move. And then in the entire habitat, this will reduce kin competition. But because of the individuals are moving, the boundaries of individual local habitat disappeared. What you see is actually like this. So when an empiricist observes this, what we are thinking is that individual already disperse a lot, and they are not interacting a lot with their kin. So probably kin competition is not a driver. But the theoretician was thinking, you know, this was the driver. If it was not due to kin competition, they are not going to disperse in the first place. So both are correct, but still we haven't really get this understood. What's happening here is what we call the ghost of competition past. This is concept raised by Joseph Cornell in this 1980 paper. So basically, a good example to illustrate is this concept is MacArthur's warblers. In this case, there's 5 different species of warblers. They live in the same habitat and they share all the resources even in the same tree, but they are not competing a lot because they can coexist and they have very differentiated niche. When you observe it now, you see that the niche are not overlapping. So they are not competing a lot. But the reason that they don't share a lot of niche and they coexist is because there has been lots of competition before, right? And this is a very interesting case to show that, to illustrate the ghost of competition past. And by the way, MacArthur did this work when he was doing his PhD. So I know that many people in the audience are early career scientists. Be confident about what you're working on now. Probably, you know, it's going to be a textbook example in 20 years. Okay, so if you want to know more about many knowledge gaps in our understanding about sex-biased dispersal, and you know, overview of different models, how to connect empirical theory work, many modeling ideas, and especially important assumptions that need to be empirically tested, please refer to this paper. Hannah and I wrote and published in Biological Reviews in 2019. I want to emphasize important assumptions that needs empirical tests because this is a basic for future models and also empirical work. One of them would be, for example, we always assume that being familiar with the local habitat helps you to gain a nesting site. And this is a fundamental assumption that Greenwood also made. But apparently, I haven't found work that show this clearly. Familiarity with local habitat actually help you with gaining fitness. Okay, and then at this point, you are probably thinking we have talked a lot about big concepts. Probably it's time to show some real work. And yes, we did make a model of sex bias dispersal and considering something very important, and that is males need food too. You might think this is obvious, but it's not as obvious for theoreticians, not only because we are simple-minded creators, and most times it's so, but it's also because considering males consuming food can make your model much more complicated. And the common assumptions in sex-specific dispersal models are that males compete for females and females compete for food, because this makes in these assumptions, but very often it causes side effect. And in many of the models, even it feels like mathematically males are producing males and females are producing females. It sounds maybe surprising, but we haven't found a model before that also actually considered the consequences of male and female siblings competing for food, and that might drive juvenile dispersal. So we want to fill this knowledge gap to disperse a model. And another thing is because we are thinking about sex bias dispersal, we must remember also there can be sexual dimorphism. For example, in this bird species, great bustard, males can be 2 to 3 times as heavy as females, and they do eat a lot more. So in our model, we build sexual we assume that sexual dimorphism in food consumption can vary, but this does not evolve. So the extent of sex-biased food consumption is fixed. And then we let the dispersal rate and timing evolve. And I think this is really nice because this is also to illustrate that dispersal is a very complex trait. It doesn't only have the probability, timing, and also Tom in the previous talk talked about the distance kernel. Lots of things can differ between the sexes in terms of dispersal. So the life cycle in our model starts from reproduction as like this red heart. And as time goes by, the newborn individuals, they can eat in the local habitat, accumulate bodily conditions, and they can also decide or determined by their genotype if they will disperse or not. So for the early dispersers, because they disperse, they leave their kin, male and female siblings, with more food. If someone disperses later, they have accumulated more bodily condition, and they will have higher, less likely to die during dispersal. And our question is, would the probability and timing of dispersal depend on whether males eat more than females? So this is sexual dimorphism. And another thing very important is if they eat from the same pot or different ones. Very often, as we mentioned, males are assumed to not compete for food with females. And it's kind of like the scenario with these 2 cats with different pots of food. But actually in the wild, we can think this left-hand side, 2 individuals competing for food is more natural. So to compare if this actually make a difference, we show the following result. This is when the result produced without competition, and on the right-hand side is with competition. And the y-axis above, that is the relative food assumption of male to females. So above this dashed line, males eat more food than females. Below it, females eat more food. And on the x-axis, we have this income and capital breeding parameter, which is also another biological reality we considered in this model. Income breeders, they need, so their recent resource intake is more important for reproduction, and capital breeders, they need to accumulate resources. And the accumulation of resources matters a lot for their fitness. we can see that this result is actually quite intuitive in case of without competition. Without competition, because female, in this case, because, forgot to mention the colors. The colors is a female and male difference in dispersal probability. So we can see that if there's no competition, females evolve to disperse more when males eat more. So because in this case, female dispersal is cheaper for females. They need less to eat less food to have the same safety to disperse. But with competition, there's no sex bias. At the same time, we're looking at the timing, which is shown in the lower panels here. The different colors show the male and female difference in dispersal timing. We can see that without competition, females evolve to disperse earlier. If males, they require more food than females. But the pattern is the other way around. If females, with competition, in this case, in this upper part, the male disperse earlier. This is actually an interesting consequence of king competition. In this case, males, even though they require more food than females to have the same dispersal mortality rate, they disperse earlier. So they sacrifice themselves to take higher risk so that their sisters can have a better chance in the local habitat. And this is driven by inclusive fitness. And also we included a case study where resembling what I mentioned, that this great bastard where males eat more than females. In this case, we assume that males eat twice as much as females. We can see without competition, like under this classic assumption scenarios, females always evolve to disperse more and also earlier. This is also because similarly, females need less food to be able to get to the condition that they can survive dispersal, so that they tend to disperse more. And males, because they need more food, they need to wait for longer and disperse less. But with competition, we can see the dispersal probability result has completely reversed. Males almost always evolve to disperse more. Here, I forgot to mention that on the X and Y axis, it's now the male-specific and female-specific income breeding parameters. So we can see that so below the diagonal, males tend to be more capital, female tend to be more capital breeding than males, and above the diagonal line, males tend to be more capital breeding than females. And this is something that may differ also between the sexes. We can, so this result, this model has produced very different results under competition and compared to without competition, this classic assumption. And what happens actually in this great bastard system, we can see that actually male chicks, they indeed grow faster and receive more feeding from their mother in the local habitat, but indeed they disperse earlier than female siblings. It seems in this case, males, they produce, our model cannot correspond to the reality that males, they might suffer from higher dispersal probability for the benefit of their siblings driven by king competition. Okay, so here is a paper about this mathematical model and this review paper again, if you're interested. So to finish, I would like to thank Hanakoko. She is a great mentor and it's very fun to work with her. I learned a lot from her when I was doing the postdoc. And that's also why I'm still very interested in this topic, even if I have moved on and explored other topics, and now I want to come back. And so in the scope of this STN. And also I thank University of Zurich, where I did this work, and Swiss National Science Foundation for funding. Also the figures where I show without this copyright information, they are all made by ChatGPT. And thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. It was super interesting. Any questions? Or yes.
Is it me?
Yeah, go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Xiang-Yi, for the very interesting talk. Actually, I just have a very basic question regarding to the classical model by Hamilton and May. It seems like even though there's seems like no benefit, it's better to disperse.
The benefit is less competition, right?
Yeah, it seems like they just reduce the competition with like king competition, but they can actually compete in another territory for more like mating or whatever chance. But in that model, there's no costs of dispersal at all, right?
Well, in their original model, there's cost. I didn't show that because I want to, show the simple case.
Okay.
But
So even with the costs, they still like more
Yes.
beneficial of dispersal?
Yes, even when the cost is close to 1, even if you almost always die, you should still disperse.
Why?
And read the paper. Then we talk.
Yeah.
Yes, Tom.
Hi, thanks for a great and very interesting talk. I was interested in the result that under competition, there's no sex bias that evolves in dispersal. Like when males and females compete for food.
Bias in dispersal probability, but
Yeah.
males and females do disperse in the timing when they disperse.
Okay. Okay. I guess one thing that I was wondering is, in the context of competition, there's some evidence for female and male like niche divergence where they would actually like use different resources. And so I guess my question is about whether like sexual niche divergence is like could be an evolutionary alternative to sex bias dispersal.
Yes.
I don't know if that question makes sense to you, but yeah, I
Yes,
know that was not in your
very
model, but do you have
interesting.
thoughts about
And
that?
this probably and important. And this also related sex mating system, because if you're thinking about monogamous mating system where one male, one female, and this male has no competitor, right? And what it can do, the best probably is to maximize the reproductive output of the female. In that case, probably males can even sacrifice himself to feed more to the female because all the female is going to produce its offspring, right? But if you, in that case, it probably makes sense to diversify the niches. Male eat something else and let female eat what she wants. But if you're thinking about lots of competition, like panmictic mating system, or even if female have multiple mating, then probably it doesn't pay off for males to diversify, to use a different niche. Maybe this will make him less competitive compared to other males who don't, right? And now it can actually lead to, tragedy of the commons, males competing a lot with each other. They actually take all the resources, so that all the females are performing very poorly. So yeah, sexual competition can cause interesting consequences. It does matter, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I will ask a question if no one has one. I'm really not familiar with all this sex bias dispersal literature, and this concept of like this timing of dispersal is something I'm really not aware, and I was wondering like why you took that into account and what does it mean actually that the sex bias dispersal probability is the same, but with timing that differentiates, like how?
Yes. So, for example, if you have half of the males and half of the females are left by the end of the reproductive season, or but all the males, they immediately leave the natal habitat after they're born, but all the females, they stay until, for example, just before reproduction occur, and then they move to another habitat. This matters because the longer you stay in the local habitat, the more resource you're going to take away from your own siblings, right? And also previously, this have not been, let's say, empirically more, let's say, recorded a lot, because has been very hard to track many of individuals. But nowadays you can track individuals more and more easily. There has been more data on the timing, and timing is generally quite important in life history. You like early, for example, an individual, if it's going to disperse, it also has been facing a trade-off, if it spend more time in a local habitat, probably is going to accumulate more body condition to be able to survive the dispersal. But if it reaches the breeding site too late, it will not be able to, for example, secure a territory or breeding site. Then it's in vain. It's not. So maybe there's also trade-off and considerations in when this individual actually leave, if it decides to, right?
Thank you.
I just follow up very quickly on that, and I wanted to ask you, Xiang-Yi, obviously the timing is something that I read in theoretical paper, mainly coming from Anna's group, right? And is saying a lot of time, this timing of dispersal is important to consider, especially relative to when the mating and the reproduction is. And so you said that people now know it's more and more. Is that kind of somebody that has pulled this data together? Do we have an overview on how this sex bias timing?
There are people, I heard that they start to tag. So as soon as for example, in some raptor species, they ring and put a chip in the fledgling chick.
Okay.
So after fledgling, at some point they are going to fly away, right? And then you know when this happens.
Yeah, but still we don't have any compilation, or we don't have a kind of a overview of this might work in different groups. I guess these are new.
No, I think we don't even have a data set or a paper that actually surveyed. We always say mating system relates to sex bias dispersal, but it's always, this mammals and birds, something like this, more related to sex bias dispersal. But there's no paper, it seems to me, that actually say in this percent of species that has this monogamous mating system, this is male bias dispersal, right? There's no direct data to show, different mating systems actually have different proportion of male bias dispersal or female bias dispersal.
Lots to do still.
Yeah, please do. I'm very happy that Greta has get me into this this network so that I can work on this very interesting topic again.
Okay.
Okay, is there any other questions or not? If so, then thank you both. for your talk. I learned a lot. Super interesting. And so the next seminar will be in a month on the 29th of May. Yeah, thanks, Ella. And it's gonna be about range expansions. So I guess Tom introduced us on those topic, and so we will have Anna Hargrave and Matthew Koski talking about this. And if you have any other suggestions of like some topic we could discuss in those seminars, please do email us. You will find our email addresses, I think, on the website. And with that, thank you again, and have a nice day or evening, or depending where you are, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
So super interesting.
Super good.
Yes, that's really good. Well done, guys.
I really like the combination.
Yes.
Ciao,
Yes.
ciao.
Cool, see you.
See you.